HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Women's Suffrage Movement, edited and with an introduction by Roesch Wagner. Foreword by Gloria Steinem. Read by Bahni Turpin. Foreword. With the women's suffrage movement, Roesch Wagner has given us a unique gift. The real words and actions, writings and debates of white and black women who fought for over a century to gain an identity as free human beings and citizens. For most of those years, black women were legally owned as chattel, forced to work and to suffer the unique punishment of giving birth to children who were also enslaved. White women were not as restricted and endangered as women or men brought as slaves from Africa, but as the daughters and wives of white men, they were also legal chattel, with no right to leave their homes, disobey orders, profit from their own work, speak in public, have custody of their own children, own property without a guardian, or affect the patriarchal laws that governed their lives. Even many or most white men who fought against slavery supported this subordinate position of their wives and daughters. When Susan B. Anthony, an abolitionist and suffragist, supported not only runaway slaves but white wives escaping their violent husbands, even male abolitionist allies warned her that she was going too far. As Frederick Douglass, a freed slave, abolitionist, and suffragist himself, wrote in his autobiography, "When the true history of the anti-slavery cause shall be written, women will occupy a large space in its pages, for the cause of the slave has been peculiarly women's cause." And this despite the fact that many white women, especially but not only in the South, aided and abetted black slavery, and also accepted their own subordinate position as natural. A century later, Gunnar Myrdal would explain in his landmark study of slavery that enslaved African women and men brought to these shores had been given the legal status of wives as the nearest and most natural analogy to the status of slaves. As he added, "The parallel between women and Negroes is the deepest truth of American life, for together they form the unpaid or underpaid labor on which America runs." Wagner takes us into the rooms, writings, and discussions where white and black women and black men, all fighting for legal personhood and full citizenship, were both a miracle of shared purpose, despite all the lethal forces keeping them apart, and later a tragedy of division that echoes in the need for intersectionality and inclusion to this day. Even the lynchings of black men, crimes designed to maintain the racial order after the Civil War, were most often justified by the proximity to white women, however imaginary or freely chosen. This tells us how dangerous and brave was the coalition for universal adult suffrage that you will read about here. It also reveals the betrayal when white men split the coalition apart by offering the vote to black men first, only to then limit their votes with poll taxes, impossible literacy tests, and violence. Yet despite this tragic division, and despite being labeled as varying degrees of non-human, this fractious rebellion and fragile coalition did eventually succeed in gaining citizenship for the majority of people in this country. Wagner brings us these imperfect and hopeful rebellions of the past as they happened, complete with their courage, divisions, and debates, plus a long organizational disagreement among women suffragists about whether to seek the vote by federal amendment or state by state. She doesn't attempt to prove a thesis or to explain mistakes or to excuse destructive divisions. Other than in the first and last chapters, each one with a very specific purpose, she doesn't insert herself at all. Instead, she allows us to witness the words and acts, dreams and disappointments, victories and defeats, visionary ideas and tactical errors of people fighting a battle that laid the basis for our continuing movement against hierarchies based on race and gender. It is this faithfulness to the past that allows us to learn lessons for changes in the present and future. In 30 or so years, this will no longer be a majority white country. It will better reflect the diversity that has always been its strength and its promise. Indeed, the first generation that is majority babies of color has already been born, and public opinion polls already show that the majority of Americans no longer support divisions by race and gender. Yet there is also a lethal backlash from about a third of the country, including over half of white married women. Often also those without a college education and most likely to be dependent on a husband's identity and income, who feel the need to preserve their unearned place in the social and economic hierarchy. That's why these victories and defeats of the past become the best possible lessons and warnings for our present and future. By taking us into the rooms where history happened, Wagner allows us to see the parallels and differences, empathy and estrangements, connections and isolations that can hinder or help our shared goals now. Almost none of the people we meet in these pages will live to celebrate the changes they are working for. This should tell us that social justice movements are not a temporary part of our lives. They are our lives. Most of the activists here were not sure that slavery would be abolished, or that universal adult suffrage would ever succeed. This should give us humility about what we can predict, and also arm us with faith and patience. Few guessed that the legal right to vote would come a half-century later for white and black women than for black men, but would be mostly on paper. In the South, where most black Americans live, it would take another century plus an entire civil rights movement to overcome procedural and sometimes violent and lethal barriers to voting. This should make us skeptical about changes that come from the top and that divide us more than they empower us. And there are other lessons. For instance, decisions can't be made for an unknown future, but we can create an inclusive and democratic way of making decisions. The ends don't justify the means. In real life, the means we choose dictate the ends we get. Most of all, we are still experiencing the scars of divisions based on race and gender, divisions that didn't have to be, and seem not to have existed before Europeans arrived and conquered or killed most of the advanced cultures already here. Fortunately, Wagner, in her first chapter, sends us off with unique encouragement. Unlike almost every other historian, she doesn't treat this country as if it began with Columbus. We are not led to assume that gender and race begin a hierarchy that is decreed by human nature. On this subcontinent, once known as Turtle Island, women's expertise in agriculture and men's expertise in hunting were once equally necessary and equally honored. Many languages had no gendered pronouns, no he and she. Children inherited their clan identity through their mothers. Women knew very well how to have or not have children, and men did not control women's bodies as the means of reproduction. Male leaders were often chosen by female elders, who also decided when to go to war and when to make peace. The paradigm of society was not a hierarchy, but a circle. Human beings were seen as linked, not ranked. It was the Iroquois Confederacy of 6 native nations with layers of talking circles for decision-making that inspired Benjamin Franklin to invite Iroquois advisors to the Constitutional Convention. Each of the 13 colonies needed a degree of autonomy, but also a way to make mutual decisions. The Iroquois governance system, the oldest continuing democracy in the world, became a model for our Constitution. Yet the first thing those advisors asked was, where are the women? Perhaps one day, our schools will teach history that begins when people began. As it is still likely to start when patriarchy, monotheism, and colonialism began. It is rare and important that this book opens by showing us that suffrage leaders were inspired by the example of free and equal Native American women. Perhaps we may also learn that some African women came from matrilineal cultures, with herbal knowledge of contraceptives and abortifacients that has been well documented. We are discovering from modern public opinion polls and current elections that Black women are almost twice as likely to support all the issues of female equality as are white women. Perhaps some of that comes not only from the necessity of their independence, but also from the stories in their memory. Now, media characterize the suffrage movement and the modern women's movement as mostly the activity of white women. But with the growing record of Native American women as the inspiration for white suffragists, and with Black women's leadership and activism now better documented, from suffrage to the results of the last presidential election, such fiction cannot survive. This is why we need to know our history. We walk into rooms of our past and listen to the conversations. Only after we have had a chance to draw our own lessons and conclusions from events as they happened does Wagner give us her thoughts about what could and should have been, and what could be now. As Paula Gunn Allen, Native American activist and Laguna Pueblo poet, wrote in The Sacred Hoop, the root of oppression is the loss of memory. Gloria Steinem. Introduction. Writing any history of the women's suffrage movement is an absurdist task. You must be in a million places at once, viewing a million things simultaneously from a million different perspectives. It's impossible, but if you take on the job of writing a history anthology, you are always aware of the arbitrary nature of what you select. Given all this, how do you proceed to create an anthology? You may decide to draw out one thread from this thickly woven fabric and follow that single line like, say, just the vote. But the thread doesn't draw out. It's entangled with too many other threads. You tug and the thread breaks. But you go with that single strand of the thread. It's not complete. It doesn't give you an idea of the vast fabric you've pulled it from or the interrelationships you've torn asunder. That's history. It's a conceit, an impossible task. And, as they say in the biz, you murder a whole lot of little darlings in the process, taking cherished writings out of the manuscript because there just isn't room in the allotted pages. This is not, then, a definitive collection of primary documents from the movement for the vote. It is rather a sampling of the voices that fought for some of the myriad women's rights issues, those who inspired them, those who opposed them, the documents that defined and reported them, and the writings and speeches they produced embedded in a running narrative. The book is a journey moving through time, with a tour guide pointing out some high spots along the way, limited by the need to move to the next location before our time together ends, or a train trip through the land of woman's oppression led by a conductor who directs you to various landmarks on the road to Freedom Land. You know that if you got off at any stop, there would be many more things to see, but you'd never be able to see them all in one lifetime. A few things to watch out for along the way. While the suffragists, not suffragettes, that was the British movement, chose the singular, woman's rights, you will find used the more contemporary term women's rights. Suffrage evokes suffering, as well it should when denied, but it means, of course, the vote. In addition, as our cultural awareness of oppression evolves, we recognize the language fostering racism and sexism in common use in earlier times. For example, our Declaration of Independence refers to the indigenous peoples of this land as merciless Indian savages, a term continued in usage into the early 20th century, along with the disrespectful term for female genitalia, squaw, to refer to Native American women. While these words have been kept as they were in the original, you may note our growing cultural awareness as you experience the inappropriateness of each of these words as you read. Movements don't have a beginning and an end. They are dams historians build in the river of history to capture the flow in a particular moment, and historians regularly move the location of those dams. The standard woman suffrage narrative by historians in the 1950s placed the beginning demarcation of the woman suffrage movement at 1848, marking the local convention for women's rights held that summer in Seneca Falls, New York. That narrative ended the suffrage movement in 1920, when the federal suffrage amendment became part of the Constitution. Scholars studying the pre-revolution period then recognized propertied women who voted in the colonies, weakening the 1848 dam, while those researching the 1830s female anti-slavery societies have suggested the beginnings of women organizing are to be found with these abolitionists. You'll see evidence of both in the following chapters. History is defined less by what happened than by who tells the story. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton sat down with her colleagues Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Joslyn Gage to tell the story of the movement in their 3-volume, 3,000-page History of Woman Suffrage, they dammed up the history of their movement from their personal perspective. A planner of the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, Stanton labeled it the first woman's rights meeting held in the country. She may be correct, but it's also possible that a grade school student going through her local newspaper for a History Day project may someday find an account of a woman's rights meeting held before 1848, setting back that beginning marker. The location of the dams keeps shifting as our perspective and knowledge broaden. Gage pushed back women's rights agitation in the Western world 500 years in her preface to the first volume of their History, excerpted here. But she and Stanton also recognized the earlier existence of gender equality practiced in the nearby Haudenosaunee, Iroquois nations. This volume, for the first time, places the beginning of women's rights 1,000 years ago at the founding of the Iroquois Confederacy on the shores of Onondaga Lake in present-day Syracuse, New York. Non-native women, on the other hand, were bound by religious dogma instructing them to follow God's edict that they be under the authority of men, with science telling them they were dumber, weaker, and naturally dependent. These women needed a model, a functioning culture where women and men lived in equality. You will read for the first time the words of Stanton and Gage, history co-editors, and the two major theorists of the women's rights movement, documenting the inspiration they received from seeing Native American equality in action. Lucretia Mott, too, as you'll read, brought that energy to the Seneca Falls Convention, Having just come from a stay in a Seneca community, one of the 6 Haudenosaunee nations, where her friends, Quaker, meeting, did support work. Mott is finally redeemed here after years of false intimations of conservative caution on her part for not supporting the call for women's suffrage in the Declaration of Sentiments adopted by the 1848 gathering. It wasn't timidity at all. She was part of 2 groups that didn't believe in voting, as it supported a government that allowed slavery and war. However, like many pro-choice women today who personally would not have an abortion but support the right of women to make that choice, Mott upheld the right of women to vote. History is not inevitably progress, nor is it linear. Rights gained may be taken away. Concerns at one time may remain centuries into the present moment. So it is with Native American women's history. As they were modeling the way for U.S. women to take greater authority over their lives, that authority was at the same time being taken away from them through violence, intimidation, law, and religion, as suffragist ethnographer Alice Fletcher warned in 1888. Never defeated, these indigenous women rise today. Sovereign women in sovereign nations, inviting us to learn from them as our suffragist foremothers did. Bringing their voices into the conversation, we come to understand that voting rights for women is not a one-size-fits-all. In her women's rights newspaper, Gage supported the decision of the Haudenosaunee leaders in 1878 to refuse the vote, which was about to be forced upon them, because with it, as you will read, it failed to recognize them as sovereign nations with their own governmental structure. Indigenous nations find different means of negotiating physical, cultural, governmental, and spiritual survival against attempts at forced colonization. For some, this has meant dual citizenship and accepting the voting rights imposed on them by the federal government with the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, using the vote and elected representation to ensure their indigenous interests are represented in their complex relationship with the United States. Other native nations like Onondaga, the center of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, refuse U.S. citizenship and voting rights, maintaining their nation's citizenship, with individuals traveling outside their territory on Haudenosaunee passports. While the United States has forced voting rights on all Native women, whether or not they wanted to identify as United States citizens, it has denied them to other groups of women since 1920. Despite the existing legal assurances, voting rights continue to be eroded in a cat-and-mouse game with the remnants of the country's male founders who continue to sneak in another method of voting suppression each time voting rights are strengthened. This compilation, then, documents not a final victory, but one more partial victory as we create democracy in the United States. Each of the markers contains its own truth, which needs to be told in depth. Recognizing that it is a beginning, not an end, this volume ends at 1920, while pointing the way forward for the further story. Challenged here are the time markers and also the narrative. Women didn't gain legal protection for the ballot in 1920, they regained it. The suffragists knew that women had voted in the colonies. We are fully awake to the fact that our struggle is not for the attainment of a new right, they said, but for the restitution of one our foremothers possessed and exercised. They echoed founding mother Abigail Adams's warning to her future president husband, "We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by laws in which we have no voice or representation," when they impeached the government for its treatment of women on July 4, 1876, declaring they had greater cause for discontent, rebellion, and revolution than the men of 1776. Women's rights were old hat by the time the 1848 convention finally rolled around. Individual women, you will learn, had been petitioning for their rights for a decade and had already won victories, such as a Married Woman's Property Act in New York. Nor were they acting alone. Men with voice and authority, attorneys, judges, ministers, journalists, stood against the tide and named the injustices done to women by religion, law, and the family. On the journey, watch for newspaper editor William Ray, who penned a woman's suffrage poem in 1821. Judge Hertel, who introduced a married woman's property bill into the New York legislature in 1836, and Unitarian minister Samuel J. May, who preached the first women's rights sermon in 1845. These individual supporters morphed into organizations of anti-sexist men who then, as today, prove essential allies in the struggle for justice. Above all other causes of the woman suffrage movement, Gage wrote, was the anti-slavery struggle in this country. It was here, working for an end to slavery, that African American and white women developed skills they would bring into organizing for their own rights the following decade. They learned how to conduct meetings, come to agreement out of disagreement, speak in public, raise funds, and take all forms of action, from petitioning to facing down mobs. Of the 5 women who organized the Seneca Falls Convention, 4 were seasoned veterans of the female anti-slavery society activism. Only Stanton lacked that background. Many today say, with reason, the women's rights movement started in 1832, when African American women organized the first female anti-slavery society in Salem, Massachusetts, or when the 139 local societies of black and white women that formed held their first national convention in 1837. Most remarkably, and seldom recognized because of the delicate language in which they couched it, you will read the words of these anti-slavery activists, women and men, as they publicly exposed the institutionalized rape of enslaved women, an act of tremendous courage at a time when it was considered racy to expose the leg of your piano because it might invite men to have inappropriate thoughts. Outraged clergy reminded these women that the Bible clearly instructed them to be under the authority of men, ordering them to go home and behave themselves. This movement was never about just the vote, nor was it a single movement. Early on, notably in the 1850s, women opened the Pandora's box of their oppression and out popped the Bible, admonishing them to shut their mouths, never wear trousers, obey their husbands, and accept everything about their condition. Some courageous few resisted and attacked the religious dogma, wore pants, and demanded ownership of their property, decent working conditions, and equal pay for equal work. Pushing open the doors to the higher education that had excluded them, they became doctors, lawyers, professors, business owners, and ministers. They quickly realized, as did feminists in the next century, that the personal is very political, as they raised issues close to home, the right to their own bodies, to their children, and to leave loveless and dangerous marriages. For a glorious decade, this multi-issue movement gained ground. With the outbreak of the Civil War, the movement suspended its women's rights activities and proceeded to make history, much of which has been lost to us. Surgeon Dr. Mary Walker was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, while Harriet Tubman was the first woman to lead a military excursion. Anna Ella Carroll developed the Tennessee Plan, which turned the tide of the war for the North. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first U.S. woman doctor, started the 7,000-chapter Sanitary Commission to aid sick and wounded soldiers, which raised more than...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?